Hey guys, we're back updating the Power Rankings for Hell's Kitchen Battle of the States following episode 9, which was another pretty eventful episode with a lot of drama, and through that there are some interesting changes to the Power Ranking, but we'll get that soon enough. But we have 10 people to talk about, and there's no more time. Let's go into the video. So starting off at number 10, we have the latest boo from the season, and here we have Alexandra, whose boo here makes a ton of sense here. I feel like she's someone who would be taken out around the spot where she was a big enough character to where they didn't want to boot her right away, but also a weak enough chef to where they didn't want to take her all the way to the black jacket, so it makes sense for her to go out in this particular spot. Though with it said, the path there was a bit wonky where even though she had a pretty bad service, there was just a lot of focus on Anaiya in this episode, and it got to the point where the red team was calling out Anaiya during the elimination ceremony, calling her like a bad presence on the red team, and Ramsey even acknowledged the allegations that Anaiya was like a drag on the red team, but despite that he still decided to keep her around over Alexandra, which was just kind of a weird look, all things considered. And yes, while Alexandra probably did deserve to go out considering her bad service and really her string of bad services across the entire season, but regardless, it was still kind of a weird look that they focused so much on Anaiya just for Anaiya to not even go home in the spot. So again, take all that for what you will. But if we were talking about Alexandra more generally, she never really stood out as a contender for me, where it always felt like she was like this big character where despite her causing a lot of drama on the red team and her like not really like seeming too likely to win the season, she was still like a big enough presence on the season to where it made sense that they kept her around for as long as they did, and for her to go on the spot makes a ton of sense, even though the actual episode she goes out in is not the way I would have expected it to, but here we are. But obviously she's now out of the game to where she's here at number 10. And with that, we have 9 people left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position. But number 9, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on is still Jayden, who once again gets nominated here, despite him not even having that bad of a service, where really his nomination came down to him just being the weakest overall chef on the blue team, with that even being like the major rationale there. And yes, while Jayden does try to defend himself by saying that Henry has been weaker in competitions, I feel like that doesn't really hold that much weight based on what we've seen. That, and also I don't think Ramsey even believes Jayden's argument there. But regardless, he does stay over Alex by the end of it. But even so, I feel like he is still like probably the weakest contender left on the board from a pure performance standpoint. I feel like he's still someone who, despite not being the biggest character in the world, is also not someone who we're meant to be seeing as that big of a threat on the season. And through that, I would expect him to be booted relatively soon here as, again, one of the weaker contenders left on the board. Even though his actual episode wasn't that bad, but I feel like at this point in the season, I just feel like he hasn't done much to really prove why he should be like the winner of the season or why he should get too deep into the season. And really, it's just a matter of time before he goes out to where he's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have another person who I've really dropped off on as the season has gone along, but at number 8 we do have Anaiya, who really has a terrible episode here, and really the culmination of stuff we've seen like beforehand, where yes, beforehand we have seen like her being a bit bossy at points, and people have been kind of annoyed by her leadership style, but I feel like this episode like really takes that to the next level by really showcasing all of Anaiya's flaws here, where early on she gets some villainous content where she's giggling when Ellie is talking about her experience with the Cook for Your Life challenge, which leads into Ellie like talking about how Anaiya thinks like she's all that and that she's there to undermine what Ellie's accomplished, and that's what bullies do. Later on, like we have her complaining during the punishment and her getting some more negativity during that. And then she follows it up with a pretty questionable service where she obviously is on the fish station with Alex and really makes several mistakes there. And while she does like try to rectify that by pushing Alex off her station, and to be fair, I do think Alex is probably making more mistakes there, I still feel like Anaiya got a lot of negativity during that service, with a lot of people like seeing her as pretty bossy and someone who was just bullying Alex the whole time. She ends up getting nominated for this service as well. And then you have Alex and really a lot of the red team just dunking on Anaiya, calling her toxic and calling her a bully. And obviously all these things are terrible looks for Anaiya. And while Ramsey does decide to keep Anaiya around, I feel like this episode really just culminated a lot of what we've seen from Anaiya beforehand, where again, like we have gotten sprinklings of Anaiya like not being the greatest league in the world and her being overconfident. But I feel like this episode just really elevated that and really marked this culmination of Anaiya like just not being a very good leader and someone who's really meant to be more of this villainous figure for the season. To where I did decide to drop her at this point, and while I did already drop her last episode, I feel like this episode just further cemented my view that she's probably just not going to win from this point on, how she is like going to be like this villainous figure. And yes, while Ramsey may keep her around for a couple more rounds, I feel like we have seen enough negativity to where it would just be very weird for her to go on to win the season from this point on, to where I did decide to drop her here to number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and this is someone who is remaining around a similar spot compared to last week, someone who I don't feel like is likely to win, and here we have Anthony. And Anthony just kind of had a fine episode here where, well, he didn't have a bad episode per se, where he did well enough in the challenge, he also did well enough in the service. I also feel like he didn't really do much to elevate my view of him. I feel like we are not really seeing him stand out as a leader at this point in the season, which I think is starting to become more of an issue for Anthony. And I think mixing that in with all the other issues I had with him before, with him just not being that prominent on the season, with him not really having an overarching story, and with him not really highlighting any strong qualities with him as a chef, I feel like those things make it so that I don't think Anthony is a super likely winner at this point, to where I did decide to keep him around a similar spot here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and this was a bit of an interesting debate here for me over where exactly to have this person. However, after thinking about it, I did decide to drop Chris here to number 6. Now, I still think Chris is probably one of the bigger characters on the season. I still think he definitely has some potential within him. However, I can't overlook that this was not a great episode for him, where for one, he is the only person to not get a point for his team during the challenge, in a spot to where the blue team dominated in this challenge. The fact that he's the only one to not get a point there is not a great look. But then beyond that, he also has a pretty bad service where he's on the fish station. He makes multiple mistakes on preparing the scallops, so much so that he has to run to the back because he ran out to get more, which is not a great look there. You have Ramsey telling him to get a grip. You have him getting nominated for the service. And you even have Ramsey saying at the end that he's on thin ice. So I feel like Chris is in the spot here to where I can't really overlook that his performance is not really living up to what I would expect out of a strong contender to win the season. And this is coming immediately after the Cook for Your Life challenge, where I felt like this could have been this turning point for Chris to really step up his game, to him really embrace him wanting to prove to Ramsey that he is worthy. And he even says at the beginning of the episode that while this is a new chance for him and that he's in the top 10, he may only be number 10. So for him to follow up that strong of an edit with a pretty bad performance in this episode is pretty questionable in my view. And yes, while Ramsey is giving him another chance here by keeping him around over Alex, it's in a spot to where I feel like he's really going to have to step up his performance in the following rounds to really prove to him why he should be staying over other people who we have seen perform more consistently than Chris. And I feel like while Chris definitely has some setup to him rebounding and some said to him taking risks in this episode, I feel like at this point, considering how bad his performance was in this episode, I can't really overlook that to where he is here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and this person is kind of the opposite of Chris, where this person has been a lot more consistent as a performer, but I feel like the edit is not as strong compared to Chris. But at number 5, we do have Henry, and I feel like this was a decent episode for Henry here, where he ends up doing well in the challenge, getting a point there, and he also follows it up with a decent enough service where he doesn't make many mistakes there. And along the way, also gets a little bit of personal content during the reward, where he reveals he has a fear of heights when parasailing, which is ironic considering that he was in the Air Force. But with that said, you also have, during the nomination ceremony, Jayden does attempt to throw him under the bus by claiming that Henry is weaker than him in competitions, which is kind of a fallacy, where we have seen Henry doing pretty well in challenges. And I feel like the show hasn't really substantiated Jayden's claims there. So I feel like that's not really much of an issue on Henry's end. But at the same time, I still think compared to Chris, I feel like Henry is just not as big of a character on the season. I feel like he's another person who, while we have seen him at points, I feel like a lot of it does feel a lot more circumstantial. Whereas I feel like Chris definitely has more unnecessary content. But at the same time, I feel like considering that Henry has been more consistent as a performer, where we have seen him doing pretty well in both challenges and in services, I feel like that was enough at this point of the season to have him one spot higher than Chris, to where he is here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and this person is another person who didn't have that bad of an episode, but I am a bit more worried at this point over this person's ceiling. But at number 4, we do have Lisa, and this is just kind of a fine episode for Lisa here, where she ends up doing well enough in the service, and while she does lose a point in the challenge, it was in a spot to where the red team really dominated that challenge, so not really a knock against Lisa there. And we also did see her weighing in a little bit during the deliberation over Anaiya's behavior. Though with that said, this episode didn't really move the needle for Lisa, where I still think she struggles with being a leader. We have seen her kind of struggling when it comes to actually leading her team in services. And I feel like at this point in the season that is starting to become a bigger issue in terms of Lisa's prospects of winning the season. And again, while she wasn't a major focus in this episode, I feel like the fact that we don't get more of Lisa at this point in the season is probably more of a knock compared to other people. So it's for that reason that I did decide to leave her around the same spot here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this person has actually taken a step forward in this latest episode, but at number 3 we do have Sydney. And I feel like this was probably a better episode for Sydney than the last couple of ones where, again, performance-wise, she ends up doing well enough in the service. She doesn't really make any mistakes there. And I also feel like she is becoming a bit more relevant in the actual story to where we are starting to see her like working more alongside Ellie and being against Anaiya. Like she does talk quite a bit about how she feels like Anaiya is being a bully, and she does speak up during the elimination. And then at the end of the episode, she also calls Alex a martyr and that now the bear's been poked, which could be alluding to Sydney like stepping up her game at this point. And in general, I feel like this could be like the turning point for Sydney starting to become a more relevant player on the season. And I feel like the fact that we got a lot of her like weighing in on Anaiya could be seen as like Sydney being a foil to Anaiya, where Anaiya is like seen as this pretty bad leader. Sydney could step up and be a good leader. So I feel like those things are at least somewhat promising for Sydney, and a major reason why I did decide to bump her up here to number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and it is the same top 2 as last week, and I once again had to debate here over the exact placement. But at number 2, I did decide to remain with my placements from last week. So at number 2, we do have Ellie. And I do think there is an argument for Ellie being number 1, where I feel like similar to Sydney, like we are really starting to see Ellie being like this foil to Anaiya, and probably even more so, where we have seen Ellie from earlier on the season talking about Anaiya and how she doesn't approve of her behavior on the team. Like you have her early on, like saying how Anaiya was belittling her accomplishment of surviving the Cook for Your Life challenge, and that if she could poke the bear, then she'd tell them to go F themselves. She follows it up with a pretty decent service where, while Ramsay does call her out for reading out the wrong order, she does make plenty of good dishes and doesn't make many cooking mistakes there, which is obviously pretty good there. And then she's pretty vocal during the elimination ceremony where she is one of the people backing up Alex and calling Anaiya a toxic presence on the red team. And I feel like at this point, Ellie is pretty clearly the foil to Anaiya here, where she is like the most directly opposed to Anaiya. And while that could be a negative in the sense that Ellie is involving herself in drama that Ramsay may not necessarily approve of when it comes to picking a leader to win the season, I think it's also positive in the sense that Anaiya has clearly been undermined. And the fact that Ellie is like being the one to point out all of Anaiya's issues could set her up to be this contrast to Anaiya, where Anaiya is being seen as a bad leader. Ellie could do the opposite and end up being a good leader, which would make her seem better in Ramsay's eyes. So I feel like there's definitely some upside that could come with Ellie like being so vocal in this Anaiya storyline. But still, there is enough downside with her like just being involved in drama and her like potentially not being the strongest overall chef that leaves her behind here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Hell's Kitchen Battle of the States at this point is still Jada. And I do think it's an interesting debate here between Jada and Ellie, as we see both of them weighing in on the Anaiya situation, but kind of having opposite approaches here, where obviously Ellie is very much opposed to Anaiya and constantly calls out all of her flaws, whereas Jada is definitely more sympathetic to Anaiya, which makes sense considering they have a pretty positive relationship, where we see her shaking her head during the elimination ceremony when the rest of the red team is calling out Anaiya. She's kind of in disapproval there. And then she gets a confessional at the end of the episode saying that she knows Anaiya is not always great, but she's not here to make friends. She's here to win, which feels like a pretty strong potential winner quote there, and one that felt completely unnecessary. I felt like the show was going out of the way to showcase Jada, even though she's not even on the same team as Anaiya and really had no reason to be weighing in on the Anaiya situation, but the fact that she did is a pretty good look for me. And I feel like her approach of not really like getting the drama and just being down to business is probably something that Ramsay would appreciate in a potential winner on the show. So I feel like she gets pretty strong content there, but I feel like the rest of her episodes also pretty decent, where she does pretty well in the challenge, also does pretty well on the service working the meat station, and also gets this pretty strong moment as well during the service where she does have a bit of a slip up with her being slow to read an order, which leads into Ramsay saying that she can cook but she can't lead, which leads into her saying that Ramsay's statement is not true and that this is a test for her. And we do see her passing the test where she ends up making a pretty strong dish, actually making several strong dishes at that. So I feel like the fact that the show like gives her this opportunity to prove Ramsay wrong and to really rise above the occasion is a pretty strong look here for Jada. And just in general, I feel like Jada continues to be pretty impressive in her actual performance here. Now, I still think there's reason to doubt Jada's potential winner prospects, where there's still the question over whether this is too obvious, whether Jada is coming off a bit too strong here in her performance. And there's also a question over whether there's a potential downfall looming for Jada here. And I think it would most likely come through her handling of the Anaiya situation, where maybe her friendliness to Anaiya could cause her to overlook like other people's issues with Anaiya to the point where it could make Jada like maybe not as effective a leader as she could be, where someone like Ellie like could be this more direct contrast to Anaiya, to where I'm not saying it's a for sure thing that Jada is going to win from this point on. I still think there is definitely a debate over whether Jada's approach to Anaiya or whether Ellie's approach to Anaiya would be the winning one. But I think for the time being, I'm still impressed by Jada's approach to all things, both Anaiya related and not Anaiya related, to where I did decide to keep her here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so be on the lookout for that. And I'm also doing my weekly podcast with Flint Masters, Gem, and Ultra over on Flint Masters channel. So if you want more HK content aside from this, be on the lookout for that. I'm on Patreon and have YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can just by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is a video. See ya.